Hello plant lovers, Matthew in Melbourne, Australia, rather than Melbourne, Florida, although sometimes I think that might be the better option. I am a grower of cold, cool, intermediate orchids without any greenhouses or grow lights, humidifiers, etc, etc. They're either indoors or outdoors or they're out of the pool. So if that rings any bells, do hit subscribe because I post every week. And my weekly postings are my musings as I stumble through the tricky, often rocky path of learning about growing orchids, of which I am a rank amateur, I must share. But I have learned a few things and here I am sharing my tiny bit of humble knowledge. And today, yes, as you can see, it's Sarcochilus time. I love this Australian native orchid. Isn't it beautiful? They're reliable, they're tough, so easy to look after, and the flowers are really stunning. And as this one has flowered, which I made a video about, I thought, why not just do a whole catch up on the family? So here we are. Let's start with this big daddy, which is, this is my own handmade tag, so you might not be able to see it, Sarcochilus hartmannii. And this one is a species, which means it is as it is found in the wild. So Sarcochilus are native to Australia. They're on the northeast coast, so the state of New South Wales, which is the state with Sydney in it, all the way up the coast. And they can grow in a variety of conditions, and there's different species of them which can be higher altitude, lower altitude. Some are described as lithophytic, some epiphytic. It's quite a mixed bag, but they are all fairly tough and fairly resilient. So hartmannii, as you can see, very beautiful flowers, white with that sort of speckling of deep burgundy inside, a lot of blooms per spike and comparatively small flowers. Now, I did read in the Bible of Australian orchids, Orchids of Australia by W.H. Nichols, which is the most amazing book. Apparently, some Sarcochilus are fragrant. Alas, I'm here to tell you that none of my three are. All right, so perhaps a few basics. Hartmannii and its hybrid relatives are lithophytic, epiphytic, but essentially they're pretty versatile and they grow in nooks and crevices, either in rocks or at the base of trees, kind of anywhere really they can get a foothold. And their roots tend to grow into the surface layer of leaf litter and soil. So, you know, you could almost say it was terrestrial in those regards, but it's not. It essentially grows in these quite tight, constrained little pockets of humus, which then brings us to the point that you need to then pop them in a loose, free draining material, not unlike basically most other orchids that you're probably going to be growing. The other generalization about Sarcochilus is that they can take a lot of direct sunshine. Asterisks, there are caveats. They love early morning sunshine, but late afternoon, very strong sun will burn the leaves, as you can see here. But to actually get great blooms, you are going to need to figure out how you can get them to have direct sunlight. And they particularly need that in winter, like a couple of other Australian orchids. It's that light and the change in temperature and day length that will stimulate the production of flower spikes. So mine get early morning sun and then they get fairly good dappled light for the rest of the day. And all mine are growing outside, so they deal with all the weather conditions of quite high summer maximums and quite low winter minimums. In Melbourne, our temperatures can get above 40 degrees, which is above, what's that, 110 Fahrenheit, really, really hot. Not often in Melbourne, and it tends to cool down quite quickly, but we can have extreme heat. We can also get down to less than 5 degrees centigrade in winter nighttime minimums, which can be, so that's between sort of 34 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, not quite freezing, but almost there. These can all take that. Tough as nuts. So this is the species, and there has been an abundance of hybridization over the last decades, and amazing hybrids are being produced. And as you can see, generally the flowers are often bigger, and obviously there's the color variation and fragrance, as we've discovered, not that any of mine are, but it's really the color variation and the size of the blooms that are the things that have been adapted from their species ancestors. So this one here, which has slightly larger flowers, slightly more open petals, and obviously much stronger colour, is Elegant Hart. That's Hart with an A, so make of that what you will. So I've had this one for a few years, and it was a fairly mature seedling, and it started to flower immediately, which is fantastic. There we go, look at all that, just amazing. Now, the only problem I had with both this and this plant this year, and here's a pest that perhaps if you're growing them indoors, you won't have to contend with, slugs. Literally, or snails, who knows, they're both evil and reprehensible, but I actually just didn't notice that a slug or a snail had been happily munching on the flower spikes. And you can see here is a spike with just a single bloom on it. That is because it was completely munched by slugs and snails. And in fact, there were a couple of others too. So it would have had at least 3 more spikes, because usually they're quite floriferous. Anyway, my fault. And this one too lost 2 spikes to slugs and snails. And also 1 spike, which is sort of bizarre, this one at the back here, actually got a bit tangled up in the leaf structure and then wasn't able to sort of mature properly. So I've been slack this year on keeping my eye on my Sarcochilus. But anyway, as you can see, they have still managed to bloom really well for me. All right, let's though move these aside. We've got some little babies here, but we'll get to those. And let's look at this one. Look at that red. It's the most stunning color. Now, this Sarcochilus, I made a video about repotting it because I bought it, I don't know, I'll have to check when that video was made, but at least 6 months ago, I would say. And I will link the video here. Now, as you can see, doing very well. 3 fantastic spikes with the most beautiful burgundy red flowers, which are just stunning. Now, it is well and truly spring in Australia, and hartmannii, the species, is always the first to open. The second to open for me was this hybrid Elegant Hart, and the last one to open was this red one. And when it was opening, I'll come in and show you, the buds actually look very white and speckled, and I thought, oh no, I thought this was solid red and it looks like it's spotty like this one. I'm going to be devastated. But no, as they opened, you see that the tops of the flowers are incredibly beautifully red, but the backs have this beautiful sort of mottled white and red. Really, really stunning. But I am happy with the progress of this. It's got a couple of new growth points coming up. So this very quickly is going to be an amazing specimen when it's covered in flowers. So that brings us to a few points. Yes, in my experience, they are vigorous growers. They'll produce numerous new growth points, and they mature relatively quickly and can flower relatively quickly. So like many orchids, it's all about vegetative growth. The more of these growth points you have, the more opportunity for flowering you have, the bigger the display is going to be in spring. And again, I will come in and show you closer, but you can see the growth is almost like a vanda, except it has multiple growth points, but it basically produces a stem with leaves coming out, and the flower spikes emerge from the leaf bracket down there on the stem, and you can get, as in this case, multiple spikes per stem, and then this stem will continue to flower successive years, but you don't get flower spikes coming from exactly the same point ever. So this growth here, there are lots of old stems from old flower points, but you can see that they're never occurring in that same bract twice. So that's the only kind of flowering rule, I think. Otherwise, it just goes for it. The more sun it gets, particularly in winter, the better your flowering is going to be. Now let's talk watering and food. As these are all outdoors for me, I'm pretty sparing with the watering actually. The environment that these plants come from, if you imagine they're either clinging in little rocky crevices or in the roots of a tree or on a branch in a crook, they're going to get water that rushes past them, which they'll absorb, and then they might have dry periods for quite some time until it rains again. They can take dry periods. So I think as a rule of thumb for growing them, the best thing I find is just to let them dry out reasonably quite a lot between each watering. I water mine less in winter, more in summer when it's hotter, and from the growth period, which is very early spring when the spikes start to emerge, I'll start to add a little bit of diluted orchid fertilizer, diluted to about 1/8 of the recommended dose in waterings, and that's maybe 1 out of every 3 or 4 waterings. And then very late winter, the beginning of the growth season, I will put a couple of grains, literally a couple, of a generic slow release fertilizer just on the top of the medium, not near any of the roots. And that's it. They're pretty tough, and I don't think you need to be really hung up on the fertilizing of these because they come from quite extreme environments and get most of their nutrients from quite an enclosed amount of leaf litter and soil. So I think a gentle fertilizing regime is all you need to worry about. Now, I of course couldn't resist adding to my Sarcochilus collection this one. I think I got this on a bargain table in a nursery. This one is Sarcochilus Isla. Isla? A-I-L-S-A. Isla. Anyway, it's a cross between Port Red and Doug Abel. Anyway, the great news about that is, as we can see, multiple growth points. I was a little disappointed it didn't flower this year. It's kind of big enough, but never mind. Next year, we should definitely be on for that one. And then the other addition to the collection is this little baby, which is a very hearty fellow, don't you think? Now, this one is a yellow one, and it's a cross between amber mandarin and Coolendal rich round yellow. Goodness me, there's a name and a half. Anyway, so the hybrid doesn't have its own name, but it is essentially, though, going to be a yellow speckled version of something not dissimilar to that, I feel. I only bought this, plant lovers, because I was buying one orchid, only one, and I realized that the orchid grower I was buying from had a minimum buy requirement, so I had to buy 4 others, poor me, and this was one because I don't have any yellow Sarcochilus, and I thought it would look great having all those different color blooms out. So that one is doing very well. Now, the last cab off my Sarcochilus rank is that. Firstly, isn't that the sweetest little terracotta pot? And as we know, you might know, but I know, I am a terracotta pot kind of guy. Why? Firstly, better environmentally than plastic. Secondly, they evaporate really quite quickly, which is particularly good for orchids. Doesn't stay soggy because the terracotta evaporates water, which also helps generally in the humidity around the plant. I find them also more aesthetically pleasing. The negative is, of course, they can break. They're more expensive than plastic, and that very fact that they are free draining and evaporative means that in summer you've got to keep your eye on plants, particularly ones that can't dry out, because they will dry out daily. So with some orchids you might have to be watering them daily in summer, particularly if you're in a warm area or if your pots are outside like some of mine. But anyway, enough of that rambling. Look at this little baby, and this is ceciliae. I think it's ceciliae. Oh, who knows? Cecilia. Let's call it ceciliae. Now, this is a species Sarcochilus, but it actually comes from a different area to hartmannii. It's from Queensland, and Queensland is a tropical state. It's either subtropical or tropical, depending which bit you're in. It will take cooler temperatures. It needs lots of air movement. But whenever I've read about it, everyone says it is so hard to grow, particularly in Melbourne. Plant lovers. So this is how it arrived. Can you believe that? I bought it on eBay, and this is how it arrived. So I'm very happy that it arrived in a terracotta pot. I am just too terrified to do anything with it. However, it doesn't need anything doing to it. It's quite happy. That pot's the perfect size for it. And like many orchids, Sarcochilus don't like to be over potted. So what I am doing with this one is making sure it's outside. It gets strongish morning light, dappled afternoon light like the rest of them, but it's a bit more elevated and a bit more breezy. What I also learned from someone who actually I think left a comment on one of my videos was that in winter this does not like to be wet, doesn't like wet roots. So as with lots of orchids, cold plus damp equals death. So I have been really assiduous in keeping this really dry through winter and only giving it a gentle watering on a sunny, warm winter's day. So far so good. We've got a new leaf coming out of the middle. The flowers on this one are much more erect and quite pink. So a slightly different flowering habit to these other types of Sarcochilus. Anyway, I am interested to see if I can get this to grow, if I can keep it alive, if I can grow it up, and then it will bloom. So this, plant lovers, is going to be a work in progress. So there we are, Sarcochilus 101. Everything's in bloom and it makes me very happy. Now, one further point, I made a video about why your orchid leaves might turn yellow, which I will link here. And a viewer in the northeast of the US left a question about her Sarcochilus, which she is obviously growing indoors because she lives in that part of the world where the winters are very cold, and was asking about leaves turning yellow on Sarcochilus and what the reasons could have been. And we went through lots of different options. Is it in a draft? Is it getting enough sunlight? Is it overwatered? Is it overfed? The usual kind of things you go through. One of her questions though was about the aerial roots. Now on this one, you can certainly see the aerial roots quite clearly here. Some of them are actually a bit dead, so I should trim them. But you can see they come out up the stem. And I will come in and show you on the hybrid here, it's got new aerial roots coming out of the stem. And the question from the viewer was whether or not the position of those aerial roots will affect the leaves that might be below it. So as the plant grows and it produces aerial roots, would the leaves below naturally yellow and die? My observation with these, which you can see quite clearly, is no. The aerial roots play no part in the stem growth or the leaf maturity, for want of a better word. The aerial roots are totally about anchoring the plant and securing moisture and food, obviously. So they're not going to affect the leaves. But, dear viewer, in the northeast of the US, you can see this plant. This one I bought online, and when it arrived, it wasn't, I can say, I think, perhaps in the best of condition. So these are all the old leaves. I'll come in and show you closely. And they are quite wrinkled and a little yellow and a little jaundiced. So it perhaps wasn't being grown in the optimum conditions. Now you can see that the newer leaves that have been growing under my care are much greener and fleshier and stronger looking. And then we have new growths here, ditto. So one of the thoughts could be, depending on the grower that you got it from, perhaps it just wasn't in the best conditions. The only solution to that is nurture your Sarcochilus. And the other question that the viewer asked was, well, how often would the leaves die? Would they turn yellow and die naturally? Which is a good question. So this, my Sarcochilus, I have had for, I think, about 6 years now, and it was already quite large when I bought it. It's a fabulous specimen. And I'm trying to remember when I have ever removed a leaf from it, and it would literally be 1 or 2 in the last 5 years. So these leaves are very, very long lasting, and you really shouldn't be having a lot of them turn yellow and needing to be removed. As you can see here, this one, bad me, got sunburnt. So the tip is brown, turned yellow, brown, the tip's dead. You know, if I was really bothered, I could trim that dead bit off, but I like to keep it as a reminder not to burn my orchids. But that leaf is also quite near the top, so it's a relatively new leaf, and you can see, well, yes, the reason why that has turned yellow is that I was just neglectful. So obviously, your leaves that are going to die and drop naturally are going to be at the bottom of the plants. And in fact, oh, God, goodness me, there we go. There is a dead leaf, which was right at the bottom of the plant. So, viewer, if your Sarcochilus leaves are yellowing, there is a problem, and you need to work through, deduct what it may or may not be. So the obvious firstly is temperature, draft, water, light. Make sure that all of those are correct. The medium is also really important, that it's not too potted in a dense potting mix, that it's in a light aerated mix. And of course, the other thing is it might have some kind of fungal bacterial problem, and you will get a sense of that by looking at the roots. And root health is going to be key to the plant and maybe helping you figure out what's wrong. If the roots are diseased and you're going to have to trim them off, the recovery is not dissimilar to any other orchid that you've got that you've had to cut the roots off. I would pot it in a lot of chopped sphagnum moss with a little bit of loose bark, keep it moist but not damp, and maybe put it in a slightly warmer, slightly more humid area just to encourage those new roots to grow. But you can bring them back from the brink of death. This orchid is as tough as nuts. It grows in the harshest of Australian conditions. So once you figure out what the problem is, and it may have been something that was the seller's responsibility, not yours, you should be able to nurture it back into life. And the other thing is, if the leaves are yellow but it's growing healthily from the new tips, you might just have to accept those yellow leaves and just live with them and just focus on all the new healthy growth that is growing if you've eliminated the notion that it could be something else sinister going on. Anyway, that was an aside for a viewer who asked specific Sarcochilus questions. I have to say though, of course, that I grow mine outside, so I couldn't give you really good advice about how to grow them inside, except they're going to need strong winter sun and don't overwater them. There we are, plant lovers. I hope that that has been interesting. I love these orchids. They are so easy for me to grow here in Melbourne. They love this climate. Thank you very much for watching. Do hit subscribe if you want to hear more of my continuing adventures. I post every week, and I look forward to seeing you next week with another adventure. Until then, see you later.